and he's also the chairman of the Winnebago Boone Integrity Task Force. To my left, your right, is Master Sergeant Chuck Davidson of the Illinois State Police. He is the commander of the Winnebago Boone Integrity Task Force. On April 10, 2021, Winnebago County Sheriff's deputies utilized deadly force against Faustin Guatigo. More specifically, deputies shot Guatigo and he died as a result of those gunshots. The Integrity Task Force conducted the investigation, and during their investigation, they interviewed witnesses, reviewed 911 calls, police radio transmission, in-car cameras, police body-worn cameras, cell phone records, surveillance video, photographs, police reports, medical records, and the results of forensic evaluations. The task force provided my office its final report of investigation pursuant to the Police and Community Relations Improvement Act. Contemporaneous to this press release and this press conference, I have issued a decision memorandum. That memorandum is to the people of Winnebago County, and its purpose is to provide an explanation of the facts of the incident, the legal principles involved, and the decision as to whether the deputies should be charged criminally for their actions that day. I understand that you have a deadline and the news is tonight. I would strongly encourage you to read that memorandum. It is very detailed, and there are facts within that memorandum that I just won't cover today in this press conference. As detailed in the memorandum, I find that Sergeant Brillard and Deputy Eaton's use of force was justified, and they acted reasonably and lawfully. Therefore, no criminal charges are warranted. A criminal prosecution for either first or second degree murder would require proof beyond a reasonable doubt that deputies Brillard and Eaton were not legally justified in using deadly force against Guatigo. The key word is reasonable. In other words, a judge or jury would need to conclude that Sergeant Brillard or Deputy Eaton did not reasonably believe that they or others were in imminent danger of great bodily harm from Guatigo. Courts have recognized that the decisions officers make need to be made in a split second. The analysis is not a 20/20 analysis of what exactly should have happened, what the perfect situation was. Rather, it's whether the officer's belief was objectively reasonable. On Saturday, April 10th at approximately 11:30, Sheriff's deputies responded to the Casey's at the corner of Mulford and Harrison, or near the corner of Mulford and Harrison. The victim, Rose Nadorium, told the deputy that Guatigo hit her with a closed fist. The deputy at the time observed the victim had a bloody lip. After that, the deputy took Rose back to the residence at 2191 Bellwort. Guatigo was not at that residence. At approximately 5:45, deputies were called again to 2191 Bellwort. Guatigo had come back to the home, had gotten into another argument and altercation with Rose, and Rose called 911. The first deputy made contact with Guatigo. He was alone at the time. Guatigo resisted arrest and went back into his residence. He came out a second time, resisted arrest again, and went back into his residence. Additional deputies arrived, and eventually the decision was made to enter the apartment to arrest Guatigo. As to Sergeant Brillard, when he arrived, he had the following information. He knew Guatigo had punched and choked Rose earlier the day, and that Guatigo was to be arrested for domestic battery. He also was made aware that Guatigo had resisted Deputy Coomer's attempts to arrest Guatigo. He also had the description of Guatigo as a black male wearing black pants, a blue t-shirt, and a green utility coat. Deputy Coomer had also advised that a 2-year-old child was believed to be with Guatigo in the apartment. When I'm talking about the residence or the apartment or the home, it was a duplex. There's a south residence and a north residence, and they are not accessible to one another. Deputies learned this, had cleared the southern residence, and it was believed, based upon Deputy Coomer's interactions with Guatigo that he was in this north apartment. So again, the decision was made to enter the apartment and search for Guatigo and the child. They received the keys from Rose, and Sergeant Brulard was responsible or the leader of the effort to go inside of the home. Much of the, taking a little aside here, most of the facts, as I've described and will describe today and even the memorandum, were taken primarily from the reports of the officers and the body cam evidence. And so I'm going to talk about Sergeant Brulard's perspective, what he indicated in his report, and what the body cam footage shows of what happened inside of that residence. Brulard states in his report that an arrest team was set up at the door nearest the garage. He opened the door with the keys given. Deputy Kempen had his taser out while Sergeant Brulard had his weapon in his left hand. Deputy Fay was the third deputy in the line, and he was open-handed for the arrest team. Deputy Fay was announcing police loudly before they entered the home. Sergeant Brulard announced the sheriff's department, and he entered the home. Although Kempen went in first with his taser and moved to the left towards the kitchen area, Sergeant Brulard followed behind him and observed a door in front of him. That was the basement door. He opened that door and observed Guatigo at the bottom of the stairs. Guatigo had matched the description of what had been provided to Sergeant Brulard earlier. The man was wearing black pants and a neon utility work jacket. Sergeant Brulard saw that he had a long metal object in his hand that appeared to be a bat, pipe, or some type of sword machete. He stayed at the top of the stairs and began to yell loudly, "Let me see your hands, drop it, drop it." Deputy Fay was also giving similar commands. According to Brulard, there was sufficient lighting and no barriers such that Guatigo would have seen the deputies at the top of the stairs, including Sergeant Brulard. Guatigo did not comply with those commands and aggressively moved up the stairs. He pointed at Sergeant Brulard and said no, and then moved up the stairs, raising the weapon above his head. Brulard states that based upon his training and experience, he believed that that weapon could cause great bodily harm to him or other deputies. He felt that there was limited space between him, Guatigo, and the other deputies, and knew that Guatigo would be in a position very quickly to strike him or the other deputies. Sergeant Brulard began to fire his firearm to stop the attack. According to Brulard, he fired an unknown amount of times at the suspect, and he continued to advance without stopping. According to Brulard, it seemed that the gunfire had no effect on Guatigo. He continued to advance and struck me with his weapon twice, once on the right hand and once on the head. He says that his vision went completely black, all the strength left his body, and he went unconscious. He has limited memory of what occurred after being struck. He does remember being assisted into a car and taken to the hospital. He also remembers that his head was bleeding at that time. As for Deputy Eaton, who also fired his firearm, when deputies lined up to enter the residence, he was towards the back, really the fourth deputy. As he was lined up at the basement door, he could not see inside of the home, but could hear deputies ordering someone to show their hands. He heard the deputies yelling, "Drop it," several times, and he heard what sounded like a person running up the stairs. His view was blocked, but he also believes he may have heard tasers being discharged. Suddenly, the deputies in front of him backed into him, causing him to not be outside of the front door towards the breezeway. He saw a male subject through the glass window with a fluorescent arms and making a striking motion towards another deputy. He could see, meaning Deputy Eaton, could see a long object in this person's hands and could hear screaming and yelling as well as gunfire. He felt at that moment that the subject's actions could result in great bodily harm to that deputy. He drew his service weapon, pointed it at Guatigo, and fired one round through the glass window. After the incident, Sergeant Ballard was taken to the hospital where he received medical attention for a contusion and a laceration to the left side of his head. He received 9 stitches and had lingering effects for months following the incident. Guatigo was pronounced dead at the hospital. On the following Monday, April 12th, Dr. Peters, the pathologist for Winnebago County, performed an autopsy of Guatigo. He provided Guatigo's cause of death as gunshot wounds of chest and abdomen. The autopsy revealed 8 gunshot wounds, one to each to Guatigo's right arm, left chest, right upper thigh, right lateral thigh, left back, and left hand. Sergeant Ballard and Deputy Eaton's firearms were taken into evidence at the hospital. The evidence demonstrated that Sergeant Ballard fired his weapon 11 times and Deputy Eaton fired his once. Based upon the number of gunshot wounds that Guatigo suffered, it is a reasonable assumption that Sergeant Ballard shot Guatigo at least 7 times and possibly 8. This is consistent with Sergeant Ballard firing 11 times, his proximity to Guatigo, and the number and location of the casings and projectiles recovered at the scene. The body cam footage and physical evidence gathered at the crime scene are inconclusive as to whether Deputy Eaton struck or shot Guatigo. Based upon the totality of the circumstances, Sergeant Ballard's belief that it was necessary to shoot Guatigo to protect himself and other deputies from great bodily harm was reasonable. When Sergeant Ballard first saw Guatigo, he was coming up the basement stairs with a large object raised in his right hand. He believed it to be a bat, pipe, sword, or machete. Any of these objects could inflict great bodily harm. Despite multiple commands to stop, Guatigo to continue to go up the stairs with the pipe still raised. At that moment, Sergeant Ballard believed, based upon his experience and training, that Guatigo could inflict great bodily harm to him or other deputies. This belief was objectionably reasonable because this perceived threat of great bodily harm became a reality. Despite being shot multiple times, Guatigo continued to run up the stairs and struck Sergeant Ballard twice with a 2.5-foot metal pipe. One of those strikes did in fact inflict great bodily harm, as Sergeant Ballard's head was seriously wounded. Further, his decision that it was necessary to use deadly force, specifically to fire his gun to stop Guatigo, was reasonable. In short, an officer may use deadly force to stop another's use of force, which could cause great bodily harm or death. That is exactly what Sergeant Ballard did. As the body cam footage makes clear, and as Sergeant Ballard stated, it was as if the bullets had no effect on Guatigo. He continued to charge up the stairs and hit me twice. This demonstrates that deadly force was necessary to stop the attack. As to Deputy Eaton, it's the same conclusion. Based upon the totality of the circumstances, his belief that shooting Guatigo was necessary to protect himself and other deputies from great bodily harm was reasonable. He was in the back of the line, and he heard what sounded like a person running up the stairs. While he had not yet seen Guatigo, at this point he had not yet seen Guatigo, and he was backed into by other officers calling him back, forcing him back into the breezeway. Deputy Eaton saw Guatigo flailing his arms in a striking motion and forcing his way towards deputies while he was doing this. He further stated that he saw a long object in Guatigo's hand. At the same time, Deputy Eaton heard screaming and gunfire. Based upon what he saw and heard, Deputy Eaton stated that he believed in that moment Guatigo's actions would result in great bodily harm or death to another deputy. He drew his firearm and fired one round at Guatigo, shattering the glass window. His belief was reasonable. Through what he heard, he understood Guatigo to be resisting with some type of object in his hand. Next, his recitation of what he saw demonstrates that he believed Guatigo was attacking another deputy. This belief was reasonable because that is in fact what was happening. Guatigo was attacking Sergeant Boulard, twice striking him with a metal pipe. His decision to use deadly force to fire his gun was reasonable because Guatigo's use of force threatened great bodily harm, particularly to Sergeant Boulard. Deputy Eaton was justified in using deadly force. A few comments. My review was to determine whether criminal charges are appropriate. It is not a determination of whether an officer may have violated police or department policy or whether civil, non-criminal laws have been violated. Further, the investigation having been completed and there being no criminal charges authorized, the investigation materials will be made public. It is this office's understanding that the Illinois State Police will release the video evidence and other reports pursuant to the Illinois Freedom of Information Act. This morning I met with Guatigo's family and notified them of my decision and answered any questions that they had. They were provided the decision memorandum. I would like to acknowledge the deputies involved, and specifically Deputy Boulard. He was seriously injured during the incident and was forced to take another man's life in the line of duty. These are two things this community doesn't want our law enforcement officers to have to face. Lastly, I would like to commend the task force for its professional and thorough investigation of this incident. Any questions?
In your conversation with Guatigo's family, what was their response?
They were upset, but I usually don't divulge what victims tell me in closed-door meetings. I can tell you that they were upset that Guatigo was that. Other than that, that's all.
Is there any update on Sergeant Boulard's condition? You said that there were months of effects afterwards.
So he's, by all accounts, fine now. And my understanding is he'll be back to work.
Any idea when?
Likely tomorrow.
Okay.
Of all the evidence that was collected, would you say the body cam footage was kind of the best evidence to make the decision that you are making today?
In this case, yeah, that's a fair statement. I think it's really important to note, because this is what the law looks at, is right, the belief of the officer is really important. And so while I think the body cam footage in this case does speak for itself, the belief of the officers and what they perceived is really important. And I say that almost because as we go forward and body cam footage becomes more and more prevalent, it's important for the public to understand that it's not just what's on video. It's also kind of what was going on in the officer's head and what their beliefs were at the time, acknowledging that these are split-second decisions.
So you've emphasized that you don't look at policy violations as you determine whether her choose or leave were justified. But what if the policy violations, put officers in that position where they had to use deadly force? I mean, do you look at that?
Can you repeat the question? I'm not sure I understand exactly what you
If
mean.
they failed to arrest them outside the house. They went inside the house when maybe they could have done something else. I mean, these things put them in a position where they were confronting this guy.
So that would have nothing to do with my analysis. I mean, my analysis is when they fired that gun, was it a reasonable use of force?
So you just looked at that moment.
Well, no, not just that moment. I mean, there's other relevant facts. But I don't second guess the decisions they made before that. The reality is Guatigo had the pipe above his head. He came up the stairs and he struck the officer. The idea that somehow they would be criminally liable because they didn't arrest him 20 minutes earlier, I mean, that's ridiculous. Follow that through to other crimes and other defendants. That's logically doesn't make any sense. So again, whether they may have violated police policy, I have no opinion of because I haven't done any analysis of that.
And you didn't look to see if these were violations of policy?
I mean, I've reviewed the use of force policy, but again, I didn't, look at those. In this case, I take the criminal law, the law, and apply it to the facts. I didn't take their use of force policy and apply it to the facts.
Those investigations are done internally?
Yes.
Is there a separate investigation being conducted as to if they committed any violations?
So Typically there is. I'm not going to speak for the sheriff as to whether that's completed or done or to come. But typically, yes.
You said it was inconclusive about whether or not Eaton's shot actually struck with you. Could you speak to why that is?
Just because he didn't know, and the body cam evidence doesn't show that he would, that he struck Guatigo. But more specifically, the forensic evidence, they were carrying the same type of Glock, and so, there's no way to differentiate the bullets found either at the scene or in Guatigo to differentiate or to determine which gun they came from. But again, it's pretty reasonable to assume that 7 of the 8, obviously had to have come from Sergeant Brulard. So that's as far as, I could go.
But the 8th you don't know where it came from.
We don't.
Hmm.
It is possible. It could have came from Brulard or Eaton.
I guess because I was wondering where Guatigo was when Eaton actually opened fire.
Well, you'd have to. It's hard for you'd have to watch the video. You'll have the
Well,
video.
it looked to me like he was on the ground. It looked to me like he was on the ground.
Okay.
I was wondering if your investigation revealed where he was when he was shot.
I didn't include that in the memo. And again, at the time that he fired that weapon, I believe that his belief that Sergeant Brulard was in great bodily harm is reasonable.
Not to completely segue away from this investigation, but there was another officer involved shooting involving the Rockford police. Do we have any idea when that investigation will be complete? I know, I believe you mentioned that the Integrity Task Force had finished both of those investigations around the same time. Do we know when we'll hear about the Rockford incident?
Sure. So in this job, 2 things have gotten me in trouble. One is when someone asks me how much is it going to cost, and I try to guess. And the second one is how long is it going to take, and I try to guess. But I believe that 3 to 4 weeks, hopefully 3, so 3 Thursdays from today, we'll be back here with my decision on the officer-involved shooting from April 11th with Rockford Police.
How long did this investigation take?
Well, so to the Integrity Task Force credit, I believe I got their investigative packet on June 10th or 11th.
4th, I believe.
June 4th. So it took me some time to go through it.
Can you elaborate on why that process took so much time for you personally?
Sure. So I think there's 2 answers to that. The first is that, and Chuck knows this better than anybody, statewide, the average is about 3 to 6 months from the time of the shooting. For me personally, I would like it to be a lot closer to 3, and it wasn't this time. It's just quite frankly a matter of me taking less meetings and really kind of putting aside the time to go through it. There were hours and hours and hours of video evidence, 911 calls, and not that I underestimated the breadth of it, but it's more of a time management thing, just to be brutally honest.
Jay, obviously this case is closed, but in terms of the use of force policy and these types of incidents, for the public's knowledge, what does it take for charges to be filed against officers in these scenarios?
Well, I kind of described it, but it's if their belief was objectively unreasonable. I guess in a nutshell, that's what it would take.
The officers believe, correct?
That's right.
Okay.
I would like to ask both you and a member of the task force. It's documented to this point that the Winnebago Boone Integrity Task Force, as well as the State's Attorney's Office, has not filed charges in an officer-involved shooting since the Winnebago Boone Integrity Task Force has been formed. Obviously, over the last year plus, there's been increased scrutiny to all types of law enforcement involvement. What can you say that, as these investigations continue to be thorough and continue to, hold the highest form of the standard of the law at this point?
The law is the law, and so in this case, this is the appropriate disposition, which is no criminal charges. I don't know how else to answer that question. Anything else?
I just wanted to double check on this. Sergeant Brulard, he is making a full recovery, is your understanding?
Yes.
Okay. And he had to go through, Do you know anything, can you say anything about?
So
you said go through
I'm
the-
uncomfortable kind of going through his medical records and exactly what went on. It wasn't just that he got 9 stitches, went home, and everything was fine. There were some lingering effects for, I think it was 2 months or so after the incident. At the same time, my understanding is that he's ready to come back to work and will come back to work.
What about the other officers, are they prepared to come back to work?
Yeah, I think, again, I don't want to speak for the sheriff, but my understanding is that Deputies Eaton and Sergeant Brulard were on some type of either desk duty or administrative leave until this decision was made. So those are the only 2 officers, as I understand it, that were kind of delayed from coming back. All of the other deputies and officers were, just worked. There was no interruption that I'm aware of.
And I guess just to make sure we are saying this correctly, so Sergeant Millard has not been in active duty to this point since the shooting.
So I would specifically check with the sheriff's office because I'm going to get my, I don't know that for sure.
Okay.
And when you say active duty, again, if he's on light duty, is that active duty, or has he just been on administrative leave? I don't know that, so you're going to have to check with the sheriff.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, thank you all for being here. Again, I would encourage you to read the memorandum, and if you have any follow-up questions, you can give me a call. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Mr.